Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the American Floral Endowment's Grow Pro webinar series. I'm your moderator, Michael Wojcicki, and I am a member of AFE's Young Professional Council, as well as an assistant head grower for Bell Nursery in Springfield, Ohio. I help oversee and manage the production of a wide variety of ornamentals and for hundreds of stores across the country. Today's session is on success with vegetative unrooted cuttings. On behalf of the Endowment, I'm excited to be part of AFE's Grow Pro webinar series that features a new topic every month, presented by an industry expert. The webinars are free to everyone thanks to the generous support of AFE sponsors. This session is sponsored by Oasis Grower Solutions and Syngenta Flowers. Oasis Grower Solutions has supplied growers of every size worldwide with quality propagation media for vegetative plants, flowers, and seed germination. Their goal is to serve every grower with real solutions through unparalleled products, education, inspiration, and support. Syngenta Flowers is one of the largest wholesale breeders of hybrid flower seed and cuttings in the world, developing and producing flower seeds and cuttings for growers internationally. They're dedicated to breeding innovative flower varieties that offer outstanding performance in the professional greenhouse, at retail, in the landscape, and in the home garden. If you'd like to learn more about our sponsors, or if you're a supplier and interested in becoming a sponsor for a topic, you can find that information and more about the webinar series on AFE's website, endowment.org/growpro. Today's session was pre-recorded in English by Dr. Jim Faust. After the presentation, Dr. Faust will join us for a Q&A. Feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A feature or chat at any time during the presentation. We'll answer as many as we can before the end of the hour. Unanswered questions may be answered through a separate email exchange. This session is being recorded and will be shared to AFE's YouTube account. Through YouTube's accessibility features, you can access closed captions in other languages. To get us started, I'd like to share a bit about today's expert speaker, Dr. Jim Faust. Dr. Faust is a professor at Clemson University, where he does research on floriculture crops and teaches greenhouse production and hydroponic courses. His research program focuses on botrytis management and post-harvest performance of cup flower crops. Dr. Faust, welcome, and thank you for presenting on today's success with vegetative unrooted cuttings.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here today to talk about having success with vegetative unrooted cuttings. Today we'll go into some detail about some tips and pointers on how to have a successful spring propagation season. It won't be everything you need to know about propagation, but some ideas for you to take back to your facilities and consider implementing. So when you receive cuttings at your facility, you really should consider this be like an emergency room situation. These cuttings are were harvested, and they're in a sense they're dying until you allow them to recover in propagation. So the way you handle the cuttings is critical to their performance. And the two most important parts of this are really the temperatures that the cuttings are experiencing and how much time it takes from the time you receive them until the time you stick them. And so this time temperature relationship is key. To demonstrate that, we have a slide here with geraniums, where we have geraniums that we stored for 4, 7, 10, and 13 days at 4 different temperatures. So 2.5, 5, 10, and 15 Celsius. So that's 37, 41, 50, and 59. And what you can see here is the performance of those cuttings after they've rooted. And you see some poor performance here even after just 4 days of storage at 15 degrees. And 15 is not that warm. I mean, 59 is not a terrible temperature, but you already start to see some diminishing performance. And of course, as you increase the number of days, they get worse and worse at that temperature. If we look at 10 degrees storage, you actually start to see some poor performance after 7 days, and then it gets worse at day 10 and 13. But if we store those cuttings at their optimal storage temperature, which would be 2.5 to 5 Celsius, you can see we actually get 10 days of storage that are pretty good. And then we start to see some diminished rooting here after 13 days. So this time temperature relationship is true of all species. Now the optimal temperature will vary with species. And so this is just a chart to demonstrate that, where we have a dozen species that we stored at different temperatures from 0 to 25, 25 being 77. And you can, and then the green is where they performed well for 6 or more days of storage. Yellow is kind of a warning area where there was some diminished performance, and then red is bad. And you can see the optimal temperature varies in that for different species. Some are more cold tolerant, some are more or warm, cold sensitive, some are more heat sensitive. But in general, a temperature that works across all of these species was 10 Celsius or 50 Fahrenheit. So that's our typical temperature when we're bringing in mixed loads of cuttings. If we just have geraniums, then it would be ideal to have a cooler at just above freezing to minimize respiration. But if we have mixed species, then we have to be concerned about chilling damage. And so 50 tends to be our safe temperature. When we receive cuttings, we need to handle them in such a way that if they come in warmer than 50, which they most often do, we need to make sure we open up boxes with an infrared temperature gun, take the temperature of the cuttings, and then if the temperature is warm, really 55 or higher, then it really is ideal to get those cuttings out of the box onto some racks and into a cooler. If we leave the cuttings in boxes, we at least to have the boxes open. We don't want to leave the boxes closed because they're fairly well insulated, and it will take 24 hours to bring a box that's at 65 or 70 down to 50 degrees. It doesn't cool off very quickly. So it's critical that we get that plant temperature down after shipment. The reason is because the plants are respiring, and in respiration, the plants consume the sugars that they have, and then those sugars are not available for root initiation. This is some data that Vijay Rapaka collected as part of his PhD project, and it shows a nice relationship between the amount of sucrose in the leaf of a cutting, this is geranium, and the number of roots that we get on those cuttings. So as we increase the leaf sucrose, we increase root number. And of course, the longer we store a cutting, we are going to be reducing the amount of leaf sucrose that is in that cutting at the time of sticking. Another issue that we need to be concerned about when we're handling cuttings is wilting. So the time from when the bags of cuttings are open till when those cuttings actually start to get misted, where those cuttings are, how warm it is, how long it takes them to get under the mist system. And so we commonly see wilting occurring before in that process of getting the cutting stuck and moved to the greenhouse. And of course, this is not ideal. We want to keep the cuttings turgid until we can get them under mist. Now, sometimes cuttings will be wilted in the bags or at the sticking line. And one thing we can do is to dip them in a wetting agent. So there's a picture taken before the dip application and after, so we can take whole bags of cuttings, dump them into a solution that has a wetting agent in it, and that improves water uptake so that you have a turgid cutting at the time of sticking and not a flaccid cutting. Just an example of this, we took some poinsettia cuttings and we allowed them to lose 10% of their mass, and then we placed them in water, dip them in water, or dip them in water plus an adjuvant, and we were using capsule in this example. And what you see here is the amount of time submerged in that solution, and as the cuttings are in that solution for a longer period of time, you can see the cuttings that are under or in the solution with the adjuvant start to recover, and we have nice turgid leaves. And whereas the ones in water don't really recover very quickly. That's because leaves are fairly hydrophobic. They have a waxy cuticle. If we just apply mist or dip cuttings in water, they don't really rehydrate that well. Adjuvant allows that water to penetrate through the cuticle of the leaf and take up water much better. And so if we're trying to rehydrate a cutting, adjuvant is very helpful. So we did this kind of a big experiment where we a capsule at different concentrations, and we dipped cuttings, poinsettia cuttings, for different periods of time. And the green indicates, gray is when there's no change in hydration. Light green is when you start to see some change. Darker green, where they become turgid, nearly turgid. And red is where we actually start to see some damage occurring. That meaning the cutting is taking up too much water, and the cells actually start to explode, and you get necrotic tissue and can kill a cutting too. So how you dip a cutting in a wetting agent depends. The proper technique depends on the concentration of the wetting agent, or the surfactant or the adjuvant, and the time that you have them submerged in that solution. And so you can overdo it, is what this demonstrates. But with lower concentration adjuvants, it takes a bit longer time. So the good practice is simply dip cuttings, and then every 5 minutes look at them, and then pull them out of the adjuvant when you've regain turgor, and you don't want to just put them in a solution and come back in an hour and then find out that wasn't good. So another important tool that you should all have in place in the spring propagation season is knowing what species are arriving and having them prioritize as to which cuttings are going to get stuck first. And so you are more familiar than I am what species you have problems with. These are kind of ones that I'm familiar with, and what we've seen over the years, where we have really high priority species where they are just they don't perform well in the post-harvest environment. Those species, we want to just get them out of the boxes as soon as they arrive and get them stuck. We don't want to have those cuttings in the box any longer than they need to be. And then we have a little bit lower priority, or we'll call it high priority species that, okay, they can stay in the box for more hours, or they can be kept in a cooler more hours, but you still want to get them stuck the day you receive them. And then you have more tolerant species. Again, temperature and time is always critical, but you can hold them a little bit longer. And these, if you have to hold them overnight because you don't have enough time to get them stuck, these would be the ones to wait. And so it's important to get the poorest performing ones, because every hour can make a difference with some of these poor performing species. And I can't overestimate the importance of this. So proper dibbling is also a common problem. So where the size of the stem doesn't match the diameter of the dibble, and then that stem just rattles around in that hole, and this never takes up water well, because you really have to have the base of the stem in contact with the media in order for water to be taken up, and nutrients too. And it's often a problem where we're sticking multiple species into a big hole, and then the Calibrachoa just doesn't get good contact, and all the other species are good enough because they're bigger or easier to root. And then you have a mixed species plug where the Calibrachoa doesn't look very good, or there's one species that's particularly weak because it didn't have good contact with the soil. Sometimes I think we forget about rooting hormone. So many of the varieties we propagate in the spring are fairly easy to root and root well without rooting hormone. But if you're having, there are specific species or cultivars within a species that can always be a little more challenging than the others, and it can be worth the effort of applying rooting hormone. Some of the things to consider is that most of the products that we have available commercially are IBA-based rooting hormones, but NAA can be a useful active ingredient. And so combinations of IBA and NAA can have some benefit. And some varieties will respond better to one hormone versus the other. So it's always worth experimenting. If you have an important variety that isn't rooting well, it's important to try some different rates and some different active ingredients, and potentially some different application methods, so that you figure out how to root that cutting the best. Because there's never a a one size fits all solution in terms of rooting hormone. Every variety can be a little different in terms of what hormone it responds well to. There's not a solution. It takes some trial and error, and that's worth doing if you have an important variety that's causing you problems. Now, recognize that there are alcohol-soluble formulations and water-soluble formulations. We tend to prefer the water-soluble formulations. You have less phytotoxicity, is less of an issue. And so these are often called potassium salt forms, where you have potassium attached to the IBA or potassium attached to the NAA. And so these tend to be our preference for products to apply. They have a little bit more flexibility. You can get them on the foliage without causing damage, compared to the alcohol formulations. Often don't work if they cause damage and some issues if they get splashed onto the foliage. Now we have different formulations: powders, liquids, gels. It's this personal preference, and some really, powders are a little bit easier to supervise, that the workers are actually doing it properly and doing it well. Liquids you really can't supervise very easily, and splashing is a little bit more of an issue. So with rooting hormones, again, you can categorize species that you have a little bit more uniformity problems or speed of rooting problems, and I identify those as really essential for rooting hormone. Others are, you don't have to use rooting hormone on geraniums and poinsettias, but especially if you have non-optimal conditions, temperatures aren't quite good, there's been some stress involved in the shipping, rooting hormones can have some benefit. As an example, this is geranium, where we did foliar sprays of KIBA, and you can see the control did not root that well compared to 300 parts per million and 500 parts per million. Very, some really nice rooting on some of these with one foliar application. The nice thing about foliar applications is you can do a lot of plants very quickly, and you don't have it. Dipping cuttings is slow on the sticking line, so it speeds up the sticking line. You spray after you've stuck the cuttings, and you don't have to spray them that day, because often the cuttings are a little wilted in the greenhouse that first day, and you want them really to be turgid when you're spraying a hormone on the foliage. So you can do that hormone application the day after you stick, or even the day after that is still fine. And so there's stem dips is one application method that we've used for a long time. Foliar sprays are still now pretty common. A newer technique is just dipping the entire cutting, where you just take bags of cuttings and dump them into a rooting hormone solution, and then stick them. And there are some REI issues with this, and some products are labeled specifically for this application method, but it's a way to treat a lot of cuttings fairly quickly, and much faster than doing stem dips. So once we've gotten the cuttings stuck in propagation, then we can actually start looking at plant growth regulator applications. And of course, using plant growth regulators for height control is common, and you know how to do that well probably, but a couple other techniques that you might consider would be trying to prevent premature flowering on species like petunia and impatiens, where the cuttings often come in with buds because it's very difficult to keep the flowers off of the stock plants. And so you get cuttings that are already budded up, or will form buds in the first few weeks after they're in your propagation environment. So they kind of look like the picture on the bottom right. And if we spray Floral in propagation during that first week, we can abort a lot of those buds quite successfully. So it's an example of New Guinea impatient that was sprayed in prop, again, the first 24, 48 hours after sticking with Floral. And then we have, same variety stuck at the same time without Floral, and you see all these buds here. And of course, those buds aren't going to contribute to the sales of that plant, because they'll simply flower prematurely. They'll cause disuniform growth compared to the other plants, and then those flowers will rot, get botrytis, and often mess up the foliage too. So there's some value at getting a more uniform crop by preventing that premature flowering with Floral applications. Another ideas when we're doing Floral, say to prevent premature flowering of geranium, which is a very good technique. We will cause some leaf yellowing on geranium. And so one concept is, well, let's mix something like B9 with the Floral during the application. And so this is what you see here, where we put in 1, 2, or 3 applications of B9 Floral, and you can see it makes the leaves, keeps them dark green, keeps the cutting compact, and aborts the flower quite effectively. Another issue with geraniums in particular is that leaf yellowing is quite common in propagation, and it's a bit of a nuisance having to clean leaves. And again, you get botrytis rotting on those leaves. And so, this is what you often see as an unstored cutting. Looks perfect, but you have to receive your cuttings from offshore. Typically, you're not taking your own cuttings, so you don't have that option. So your cutting has been shipped and stored, and you get leaf yellowing. Well, applying BA, and actually BA in combination with GA at low concentrations, can minimize this leaf yellowing. You do have to be careful if you put too much BA and GA on. You will inhibit rooting, because the leaves become, in a sense, more selfish when they receive BA and GA. Those leaves are sources of sugars for the shoot tip and for rooting. And if you apply BA and GA, you're basically signaling to the plant to hold the sugars and nutrients like nitrogen in the leaves and not export them to the base of the cutting. And so you apply these products too aggressively, and you will delay slow rooting. The leaves will stay nice and green, but they won't root well. So it's a balancing act, but it's a way. This is a technique that works for minimizing leaf yellowing of geraniums. So we'll move on to moisture content, misting, and nutrition in propagation. These are a combination of things that you have to get right to have success. When you look at moisture content, this is data that we have with poinsettia, where we have saturated media on the left, and then media that's 77% saturated on the far right. And so you see this nice hoop-shaped curve here, where there's a sweet spot in the middle where we're like 80 to 85% saturation, and the plants are rooting very nicely. We get too wet, and we inhibit oxygen diffusing to the roots. If we're too dry, then we just have drought stress that slows rooting. And so maintaining this ideal moisture content is one of our challenges. If we use a media like an oasis, one of the beauties of it is that the foam never really, even when it's saturated, never holds too much water, so you can't really overwater it. So it makes it a little bit more forgiving to use. But if we're using a peat-based media, we do have to be careful, especially if the media has been heavily compacted. We need to be able to supply enough oxygen to the roots, and so we need to avoid oversaturating the media with water. So in propagation, we will see nutrient deficiencies pop up. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron tend to be the most common ones. Nitrogen's just an overall yellowing. Phosphorus is purpling. Iron is the shoot tip yellowing. And here you can see actually multiple symptoms on these Calibrachoa. And these can pop up fairly quickly if our nutrition program is not good in propagation. And why these will pop up is because the nutrient concentration in the tissues declines pretty dramatically in the first 10 days in prop if we're not applying adequate nutrition. Some growers think, well, you really don't need nutrients until we have roots, and that's not true. We need nutrients on day 1 in propagation, because the cutting will take up nutrients, just like a cut flower. When you put cut flowers in a vase, it takes up solution. You put a cutting in propagation, it takes up solution. And if we have nutrients in that solution, the plants are getting those nutrients. These data show how phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and potassium, this is on the tissue analysis of the whole cutting, at the day of sticking, and then over how you can see how it declines dramatically, almost a 50% reduction in these nutrients over 10 days if we don't supply some nutrition. So we're trying to keep these nutrients up, and we have techniques to do that. One is to not mist too aggressively. If we mist a lot, the nutrients that are in the propagation media will get leached out. So for example, we have some vinca here that we propagated without mist under a little tent. Here was a low mist frequency and then a high mist frequency. So even the low mist frequency without nutrition, these cuttings show some pretty ugly symptoms. Under mist, without any mist at all, they look just fine. So that the mist was leaching these nutrients from the media and the cuttings. And so mist can not be our friend sometime. One of our solutions could be to put a tent over the plants so that we don't have as much water leaching through the media. And it can be plastic or remade fabric, can both help. These also help if you have silver leaf species that really don't like, or hairy species that don't like a lot of water on the foliage. These systems can help. So this is an example with petunia. It's a variety that was grown several years ago that everybody was having trouble propagating. And so we did a combination of treatments looking at basically the water and nutrition situation. And what we see here is that we had a combination of using high mist frequency, no fertilizer, and no rooting hormone. And these plants would look really, really bad. And you pull them up and the roots really, really poor rooting. And they just never recovered very well. We did a treatment that had the opposite, where we had no mist, so we tented them. We actually applied fertilizer as a drench, and we used rooting hormone, and then you have cuttings that perform absolutely wonderfully. Not all petunias need rooting hormone, but if you have a variety that is showing these nutritional problems, rooting hormone can help. Getting enough fertilizer into the media helps, and minimizing the amount of misting you do helps. You may not tent petunias, usually need to, but you certainly can't over mist and be flushing out the nutrients out the bottom of the pot. Another technique that you can use is to improve nutrition and propagation is to add fertilizer into the mist system. So this is an example where some Veronica cuttings have been misted continuously for 19 days with 50 parts per million nitrogen and versus water. And you can see the growth differences that you're achieving there just over 19 days by having some nutrition available to those cuttings. We do need to be careful with over misting. We can cause shoot tip abortion, most common with petunias and calibrachoa, but other species it can happen to also. Again, water sitting in that shoot tip, and then it rots out, and then it's not good for the future of the plant. So when we're managing water in propagation, one thing is to look under the trays and just get a sense of how much leaching is occurring. So this would be a really bad situation, as you can see here. What you want to see is a fairly dry floor with maybe just some dots of water where the individual cells have holes in the bottom. Another tool that I think is really simple, and it helps me when we're propagating stuff on campus, is just to take a saucer and put it on the bench where you're propagating a crop and seeing how much mist is accumulating, how much water accumulates in that saucer over a week. And if you see the water accumulating a lot, you realize you're applying a lot of, because really you should just be putting enough water on so that it evaporates before you put the next flush of water on, the next mist event. And so if you're accumulating water, that means you're adding more water than is evaporating. And of course that water is then just leaching nutrients out of the media. So it's a nice way to give you a gauge on how much water you're applying. Recognizing that the amount of water that you apply needs to change with each day the cuttings are in propagation. So this is data we collected on osteospermum cuttings, and it shows basically how many milliliters per hour cutting is losing in propagation. And so during the day, it's higher than the night, but each day and night you have less and less water loss. When you first stick a cutting, the stomata are not functioning very well, and so the plants are leaky, and so you have to mist more on the first day than on the second day, and then more on the second day than the third day. So each day there's less mist needs to be applied as the plant begins to regulate its water loss better. So once that cutting's been harvested from the stock plant, it really suffers a bit and has to recover in propagation. And so your mist, if you actually recorded the number of mist events that you apply on a daily basis, it should look like something like this. These are some data we collected for vegetative annuals and some geraniums, where the number of mist events on day 1, day 2 after sticking. And you should always have this sort of curve where every day through that 10 days of misting is going to have less mist, assuming the weather's the same. Obviously, cloudy and sunny days, you're going to adjust, but yeah, the plant's demand changes. Okay, so I think a last topic that we'll talk about today is light. Achieving the right light levels in propagation is challenging because your eye is a terrible sensor. You really need to make measurements to know how much light to provide, because we put shade in propagation to help the cuttings not suffer from too high light and drought stress, but we can easily overdo it if we're not careful. And so this is some data from Roberto Lopez showing the DLI in propagation and how it affects rooting. And you can, this New Guinean patient, it's clear that you get higher DLI, you're getting higher rooting. And really a threshold of about 4 is you don't want to be below 4. And so these are our targets in propagation. Really, prior to rooting, we're looking at 4 to 8 moles per day is what we're looking at DLIs. After rooting, so the first 2 weeks we're at 4 to 8. After rooting, we really want to be 6 to 12 in that range on a daily basis. And then after transplant, we want to be 10 to 20 ideally to grow good quality plants. The challenge is, making measurements. What sensor do we use? So there's been a new sensor introduced by Apogee Instruments in the last couple of years that is a nice, small, affordable tool, and it shows you current light intensity. It shows you the current DLI for the current day that you're in, and then it has an archive that you can toggle through and see what the DLI has been for the last few days. So you put this above your mist system in propagation, and you can see what DLIs you're delivering, and then you can make adjustments with your shade curtain system so that you can reduce or increase the amount of shade that you're providing so that you're in that target area, so that light is not limiting rooting and propagation. All right, so that was a presentation for today. I'd like to thank our supporters that allowed us to do this work, and that'd be the Floriculture Research Alliance and the companies that support our research, and the American Floral Endowment and the USDA Floriculture Nursery Research Initiative allow us to do experiments and get good data, good pictures to communicate this information to you. Want to let you know that on March 21st, Dr. Brian Jackson will be talking about the current status and recommendation for soilless growing media. So I look forward to hearing that, and I think you'll enjoy that presentation. And with that, I will take any questions that you may have.
All righty. Thank you very much, Jim, for the awesome presentation. I'm going to go ahead and open everything up to the Q&A. I see we have a few questions that Dr. Jim already went ahead and answered. I'm just going to go over them for anyone who might not have seen them. So the first one, somebody was asking about what adjuvant you use. And so you just went ahead and said capsule. I know you kind of went over that a little bit more in the presentation afterwards. Somebody else was asking about the B9 and Floral rate for geraniums. And so if you want to go ahead, talk more about
let me
that.
elaborate on that. So with the rates we used in that particular experiment was Floral 500 parts per million and B9 2,500 parts per million. The Floral we usually, the range that we're typically using would be 250 to 500. Of course, with Floral, the efficacy is highly affected by the environment in which the plants are sprayed. So because the solution needs to stay in contact with the plant for a long time for it to be taken up, because it is taken up by the plant quite slowly. And so humid environments, cooler environments, you get a much bigger response than if it's warm and dry. But 250 to 500 is kind of our typical rates. And you know, some of it, you just have to do some experimentation. Occasionally you'll have varieties that are a little bit more sensitive to Floral than others, and 500 might be a little too strong. The symptoms you see if there's, if it's a little too strong is a little bit of yellowing, a little bit of leaf curling. You know, so you can look out for that and adjust the rates appropriately. B9, usually, you know, the low end of the scale is 1,000. High ends 5,000s, and so in this experiment we did 2,500 and seemed to work pretty well.
Cool, that sounds great. So on the point of Floral, somebody else also asked, what kind of rate do you recommend for pre-budded cuttings that come in for New Guineas? Yeah,
again, that 250 to 500 is a, you know, I probably start at 250 and would go up to 500, but you know, you're going to get a stronger response obviously with 500 and more thorough, you know, knock out most of the buds better that way for sure. What's interesting to me is we've done this with double impatiens and New Guinea impatiens, where we'll spray flowering plants in the greenhouse, and those same rates don't give us near the effectiveness as we get when we're spraying cuttings in propagation, because the cuttings in propagation, the plant's much weaker, right? It doesn't have a root system. It's just been harvested, and it's kind of kind of a good bit of stress. And so you tend not to need quite as much in prop to get the same response as if you're applying it to a healthy plant in a greenhouse that has higher light levels and a good root system.
Awesome, that's a great answer there. So somebody else also asked about mixing your adjuvant with a rooting hormone, and if you've tried that out for dips. And I guess also to extend that, what could you talk about, like mixing any sort of fungicides or insecticides as well with any sort of pre-plant dip?
Sure. So we have not, that I can recall, mixed rooting hormone with an adjuvant like capsule. I guess it would likely be fine to do that, but we haven't done it, so I can't recommend it. But with that said, there are quite a number of products that you can mix together to get, to save labor. And so, for example, growers that are spraying rooting hormone, if there's something else that you want to be spraying at that time, like fungicide for botrytis control, there's no reason to not tank mix those. Or growers that are dipping cuttings in a rooting hormone, well, it's an opportunity also to be dipping them in a pesticide for mites or thrips, because that's a very good technique when you bring in new cuttings to not be introducing thrips and mites into your propagation from whoever you bought the cuttings from. So dipping them in pesticide is a good practice, and so you can certainly tank mix some of these things to save some labor.
Sweet. So another question I have, somebody was saying that they're using Crest. I'm not familiar with that part. Are you familiar with that, Crest?
Crest? No.
Yeah. Hey, Juan, would you mind giving some more back information on what Crest is? I see you submitted a question there.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
So wait and see if he adds follow-up information. He was saying he was getting some good rooting with some genera, some like petunia and salvia, but having a hard time with verbena and labularia, and was wondering maybe why. So I'd be curious to see what it is. So another question here for you. Would you be able to talk a little bit about misting at night and if it's necessary or not?
Sure. We think of misting at night being important for the first 2 nights. As I mentioned during the presentation, is that cuttings tend to be pretty leaky when you first unpackage them and put them in propagation, and so that the first night or two, mist is often needed, especially in the winter months where we have a fairly long night, and if you're providing heating as you would be in winter, the greenhouse can dry out a bit too. So we have made the mistake ourselves, sticking cuttings, and the mist system in the afternoon in the winter, mist system turns off at 5 o'clock, and the next morning you come in and your cuttings are severely wilted. So usually we miss the first 2 nights, and then really the plant's ability to regulate water loss improves pretty dramatically after the first few nights. And so we don't ever really do mist after the second night.
Awesome. So I did have a bunch of people come in and chime in on Crest. So it is a cytokinin, GA, and an IBA product. I believe that was what we said. Yep, cytokinin, IBA, and GA. So they're saying they're having good success with Petunia, Salvia, Veronica, but not really having much with Lobularia and Verbena. Is there any sort of idea like why they might not be having?
I don't know the concentrations of those individual things, and so that's one of the challenges you would have with a product that has multiple active ingredients. The purpose of cytokinin and GA on I'm assuming this is at the time of applying, at the time of sticking, is what it sounds like, is that cytokinin and GA is used to prevent leaf yellowing. And it works well, but if you use too much, it will certainly inhibit rooting. And so what is the concentration of those products relative to the IBA concentration? Most often with herbaceous plants, we're starting with a concentration of IBA for dips as 1,000 parts per million, but for sprays, for KIBA, we're usually starting at about 100 parts per million active ingredient, and then going up, and usually the max is about 500. But species sensitivity varies a lot. So poinsettias, you can get pretty good damage with the foliar spray of KIBA at even 100 parts per million, and other species you really want to be at 300 or 400 and pushing 500 parts per million to really get a good response. And I will say too, sometimes we've had petunias will apply 500 parts per million of KIBA, and they look a little weird for a few days. So it might not be ideal, but they tend to grow out of it and recover and look fine in the long run. But they will give you a little bit of ideolation and yellowing in the first few days after application, but it doesn't ruin the plant.
Awesome. So another question I have here, I know you mentioned about including fertilizer in your mist system. If a grower doesn't have an option to do that, what kind of rate would you recommend to irrigate with?
Yeah, we will often drench the media with 100 parts per million, kind of just like it was a normal fertilizer application. And yeah, so about 100 parts per million, and we'll do that because in propagation the soil is usually wet and there's not a need for drenching, but to get the nutrition in there, you just have to flush out the water with a fertigation solution. So we will do like 100 parts per million nitrogen on day 1, and then come back later, day 3, 4, 5, and then again somewhere 7, 8, 9. So do it multiple times during propagation. Again, the less you leach, the less you have to apply as a fertilizer. But yeah, so we'll do it 2 or 3 times during a 10-day propagation cycle. The other option is having fertilizer as a starter charge in the growing media, and that can work well too. Sometimes it helps to supplement it still with a drench.
Awesome.
So
go ahead.
No, I was just going to read this next one. I guess she's, do you recommend full spectrum of light or specific wavelengths? For propagation, I think it's just the total, it's really just a DLI response, the total number of photons. I don't know of any data that suggests that any specific wavelengths are that helpful. And that would be especially true in a greenhouse situation, where it's much harder to manipulate wavelength when most of your light is coming from the sun. Wavelengths are a little bit easier to manipulate in a sole source lighting situation where there's no sunlight. But it's mostly just how much the total light you're getting, visible light, as opposed to specific wavelengths.
Cool. Let's see. We got another question here. So for dips and whatnot, I know you mentioned some pesticides. Would you be able to recommend any products for controlling spider mites in dips?
I think that's probably out of my expertise. The one I think I've seen recommended the most is tetracurb, but I would pass on making a solid recommendation on pesticide application.
I'm going to write that one down for me. I actually haven't heard of that one. So
yeah, I think again, Rose Bettenhouse at the University of, I know she's at the Vineland Experiment Station in Ontario. She's done a lot of work with dips for thrips, and I think she's also done them for mites, for dipping cuttings prior to sticking.
Cool. So I do have a question going back to lights really quick. Would you be able to share the light meter that you mentioned by Apogee, the information for that?
Yeah, well, you just go to the apogee.com website. I don't remember what they're calling, if they're calling it a DLI meter. It's a new product. They have a couple different types of meters that you can use for measuring DLI. This one is just a very nice small handheld, so it's it's not very big. It's relatively inexpensive for a light sensor. And I know they introduced it a couple years ago, but with the shortage of computer chips, it took a while before I think they were really selling it fully. But I think you can just find it on their website now or reach out to them. Is what I would do. It's really pretty handy little tool, because it takes about 30 seconds to get some very nice data. It's just putting a light sensor in propagation is always a little bit challenging, because you don't want it to get soaked. So yeah, kind of have to get it above the mist system and protect it from the mist. So yeah, that's always a little bit of a challenge.
Awesome. And I see someone from our AFE team here just sent a link to Apogee's website. If anybody's interested, just go ahead and check in the chat and you'll be able to take a look. I'm going to go ahead and ask another question here. So for propagation, this is actually coming from me. So we use mist on everything. Would you be able to talk a little more about the tenting process and how you go ahead and tent what you have in prop, like what material, how you keep things turgid underneath the tent, and so on?
Yeah, so mostly I see growers tenting where they're dealing with species that are really sensitive to water, or the grower has poor water quality. So I've seen where if you were growing like a lot of the herbs, rosemary and lavender, and you'll see, well, buddleia is not an herb, but the silverleaf species, hairy species, they just don't like a lot of water on the foliage, and the poorer your water quality, the more of an issue it is. So if you have a fairly high EC water, it's more of an issue. So tenting can be done in a couple ways. Sometimes you'll see remay used, and remay actually on the plants, lying on the plants, or just suspended with PVC above the plants. And so then, you keep the remay fabric moist. So you create a humid microclimate around the plants, but the plants aren't really getting wet, or very little moisture gets through the remay, and then you're not having any leaching, which is helpful. And I've seen people do white plastic. We've done white plastic, or a combination of remay and white plastic. So they'll have the white plastic for the first few days, pull it off, and then the remay is on for the remainder of the next 6 to 8 days or so. So it's kind of a 2-stage tenting. And again, it can be on a frame or lying directly on the plants. Clear plastic usually doesn't work very well because it gets too hot under the clear plastic. So milky white plastic can work, but obviously these things are reducing the light the plants are delivering, or excuse me, the plants are receiving, because they are the white is reflecting some light. So that's the biggest drawback, is you are reducing light levels, and that can impact rooting. But again, it can be very helpful if on plants that are really sensitive to water. And those are specifically the usually silver-leafed and hairy leaf species are really the tough ones.
Awesome. Yeah, that helps out a whole lot. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I got a couple more questions here. I appreciate everyone keeping them coming. This is really an awesome engaged audience, so it's pretty sweet. So somebody asked, or they said that they have like oversaturated media trays, and if they have any suggestions for drying down your trays without letting your cuttings get too dry.
No, that's a tough one, because increasing air velocity would dry them out, but gosh, that the cuttings are going to dry out a lot faster than the soil. So I think the answer is to not oversaturate over mist, because once that soil is really wet, yeah, it gets tough. Yeah, I think it's avoidance rather than solving that problem is the solution.
Yeah, I think that's pretty solid. I know, like, we had to change our propagation mix here because we had things staying too wet for too long. So just the well-drained media is also a good way.
Well, that exactly that, misting properly and having a media that is not so easily oversaturated. And part of that is filling trays. If you're doing loose fill, that you're not compacting the trays too much and reducing your porosity. Some of the stabilized media, things like Oasis foam and rock wool, they kind of almost idiot proof in a way, because you can just sit there and mist and it never holds too much water. It kind of makes your life easy. But you kind of do the same thing in choosing your media texture and how you fill the pots, so that you just don't, so if you're at container capacity, you're putting as much water on as that media holds, it's not too wet. So having a good substrate and filling trays properly is as important as misting strategy.
Sweet. So I have another question here. I know you kind of touched on in your presentation, but somebody was asking if you have any suggestions or protocols when it comes to rehydrating URCs.
Yeah, I think the easy thing to do is to take a product like capsule, 4 ounces per 100 gallons or a little higher than that. Make a solution of the volume that you need, take your cuttings, dip them in, and really just check the cuttings every 5 minutes. Then you can't get into trouble that way. Because if you leave them, like I mentioned, if you put them in there and you come back in 30 minutes, well, you might overdo it. And usually can tell if you've caused damage immediately, because the tissue looks water soaked and is dark. And so you're in trouble. And the next day or two, that tissue that's water soaked turns necrotic. So if you don't use too high a rate of capsule, so again, 4, 6, 8 ounces in there is not so high. It does vary with species though. There are species that get that water soaking happens pretty easily, and others, they have a stiffer leaf like a rose. It doesn't water soak very easily at all. But just check the recovery from wilt to turgidity every 5 minutes, and once you kind of get the leaves back up and the stems stiff again, then pull them out and stick them, and just don't leave them in there forever.
Awesome. Well, that about wraps us up. I did notice that somebody from AFE went ahead and messaged that there is a lot more information on plant dips that's kind of set up by the funded research for AFE on our website. So if you want to go ahead and check that at endowment.org. You should be able to find some more information there as well. Want to go ahead and thank you. This was an awesome presentation. I think it was really timely and very helpful for me, and I'm sure a lot of our audience. So I appreciate you going through all those questions and helping us all out. I'd like to go ahead and thank everyone for joining us today for another session of AFE's Grow Pro webinar series. And I'd like to remind you to join us on March 21st, 2023 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for our next session on the current status and recommendations for soilless growing media. Visit endowment.org/growpro to see our full list of upcoming sessions, past webinar recordings, other grow-related resources like pre-plant tips, and research reports, all of which are available for free, thanks to our industry supporters. We also would like to thank you and ask you to please complete a brief survey about today's session, where you can suggest additional topics and help us continue to improve these webinars going forward. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful week.